it's one thing to do the investment. The other thing is you're creating basically your investment empire from a corporate structure perspective.
Welcome to the Freedom Point Real Estate Podcast, where we talk about creating more time freedom through passive real estate investing. Passive investing in real estate challenges conventional investment wisdom. We are passionate about learning and sharing resources with others who are ready to transform their investing mindset. Quick disclaimer as always, I am not a CPA, I am not an attorney or a financial advisor. This is not financial advice, not telling you or anyone else what to do. The views and opinions expressed in these podcasts are provided for education and informational purposes only and are not necessarily the views of my employer, ADP. I'm glad you're here. Now let's dig in. All right, welcome back, Freedom Point Podcast listeners. Thank you again for jumping into another episode of the Freedom Point. We're so happy you're here with us again today. Really appreciate the loyalty of our fellow listeners. I've got another wonderful guest with me today, Axel Meierhoefer. Axel, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jeremy. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Look forward to a dialogue with you today. Just a quick bio on Axel. Axel is a former Air Force officer. He and his wife built a modest real estate portfolio, securing their financial future and that of future generations by leveraging 80% of other people's money and working, get this, less than 24 hours, not per week, but per month. Driven to empower others, Axel hosts the Ideal Investor Show to educate through insightful interviews, daily mini episodes, and the Ideal Wealth Grower system. Axel, certainly it goes without saying, but absolutely would love to talk a little bit more about, kind of your background, what got you into, really real estate from being a former Air Force officer and what really kind of maybe inspired that transition.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I was in the Air Force, and because I was flying jets, there is a certain point in your life, I could maybe say in the life of the body, where it says, I can't handle that stress anymore. So the Air Force actually gives an opportunity instead of, signing up forever. When the flight surgeon at some point says, okay, you're kind of getting to the end of the line, they give an option to say, do you want to switch to flying a desk or do you want to retire? So I decided I rather retire and was recruited via a software company as an executive with the responsibility of customer service and training. I've been an instructor, so I knew a lot about training and I learned some about customer service. Did that for about 4.5 years. And in both of those occupations, both as an employee / executive and as an officer, I basically had never really to think about where is retirement money coming from. That was kind of baked in. And then in 2005, I started my own business because I had finished my degree in leadership and organizational change. And the company I was working in was pretty much doing exactly all the opposite of what the theory in the university said we should do. So I thought, well, maybe I should try it myself. But shortly after starting this, I realized, okay, so as a small business owner, initially just me, myself, and I, the three of us, being in that business, there isn't really no automatic baked in anything for retirement. And I knew when you've worked for, at the time, about 25, 26 years, and other people get retirement money after 45 years or so, I would be short and started to look at what could I do? Now, that was 2005, like 2 years removed from the dot-com bust. And I was pretty sure I didn't want to try to build a retirement something with stocks and looked for what else could I do. And I found out that a lot of successful people invest in real estate. And so I thought, well, let me look into this and started studying. And ultimately what happened is the company, that software company, was stationed or situated in Santa Barbara, which is, as anybody knows, a very expensive area. And since we were living there, I also started my business there. And it became pretty clear very quickly that wouldn't be the area I could do investments, at least not in any reasonable time. And so I started studying how could you invest in real estate if that's the thing you want to invest in when you're not anywhere close to affordable real estate. And that's where, for the Ideal Wealth Grower model, this whole idea of investing out of state using turnkey providers came from. And I started doing this purely for myself and my family, just wanted to supplement what I had already as potential retirement income. But I'm a blabbermouth. That's also why I have a podcast, so and I told everybody who either wanted or didn't want to listen to it what I was doing, and especially when we were closing on a deal and stuff. And ultimately, people start asking, "Huh, that's quite interesting. Can I do this too?" And I would say, even to this day, yes, it is not complicated, but it's pretty complex. And to do it well and avoid all the pitfalls, you want to have somebody on by your side until you're relatively confident. And so that's why I started the mentoring program.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. Just out of kind of curiosity, what types of assets then within the real estate, sector are you primarily focused on? And then are there any, particular markets that you like versus others?
Yes, so I studied what different options do we have. I looked into syndications, I looked into real estate investment trust, I looked into multifamily, I looked into commercial, and also obviously I looked into residential. And the residential was initially the most closest to me because as an Air Force officer, you move around every 2 or 3 years. So you kind of have to look into the residential situation anyway quite often. But further study actually showed me that for a regular person, who wants to become a real estate investor, the residential side is actually the side, if you were to ask me, that on the one hand gets pretty much the most support from the government, and it is at the same time the biggest market. And with the right setup, you can pretty much do it from anywhere. So those were the three things that I discovered while researching it that ended up for us to end up initially myself and for my family, and then also for our clients. And the rules, I'm sure your audience knows about. If you don't mind me saying, it's really you buy single family homes and then anything like duplex, triplex, fourplex, and all of those basically four options all fall under the umbrella of residential real estate, all the same rule sets, and the barrier of entry is relatively low. And I'm saying this because if you say, okay, I want to buy like a 30-unit apartment complex for 3 million, the first thing any bank or any lender is going to say, how many times have you done this before? If you say this is my first one, there's pretty much zero chance to ever get started. And then the other part, I mean, if we want to dive one layer deeper, is I for myself was very keen to have control, and I know all our clients are very keen to have control over their assets. Right? I always say it's one thing to do the investment. The other thing is you're creating basically your investment empire from a corporate structure perspective. Right? I recommend to have an LLC, that your rents go in, that your mortgages are paid from, but more importantly, in the mindset game, to say you want to learn, even if you're an employee, that for that part of your life, you're the king of that empire and everybody is working for you. You're hiring, in a sense, a team. If you want to be a little more corporate, you can say that you're the CEO, property management is an employee, bank is an employee, insurance people are employees, appraisers are employees, property inspectors are employees. In a way, to some extent, even the tax treasurer for the county is, in a way, not really an employee, but you have kind of like a B2B relationship to them. And so, what I'm also trying to do in our program is obviously help people avoid the pitfalls and find the good investment opportunities, but also to get them set up so that the second component that we are actually trying to help them achieve is this generational wealth idea. And for that, it needs to be professionally set up because, if my wife and I were to be run over by a bus tomorrow, our daughter would just step in and same amount of effort required to basically continue to run the trust and everything underneath like a Christmas tree.
That's
Right.
right.
So now the second part of your question about the locations, I would say in a nutshell, you want to look, at least that's what I recommend, you want to look at places where you can still meet the 1% rule. Right. And so some of the places that we're in right now are places like Idaho, Tennessee, Ohio. Um, yeah, there are some other places. Now, this is just the first initial criteria to say, is it even worth looking further? Now then you have all this other stuff about economic strength and crime rate and in and out migration and so forth and so forth. But if your first thing is the property costs 300,000 and the maximum rent you can make is 2,000, it's out of the picture. You don't even need to continue.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I really appreciate you highlighting the fact that the team is so incredibly crucial to your ability to execute, in real estate. The challenge with a lot of people that want to get into real estate investing for the first time is they don't realize that you need to have those relationships, in place, even before, you decide to sign, on the front side of that check to purchase whatever that piece of real estate property is. So I'm thankful that you highlighted that. For those of our listening audience that don't understand what the 1% rule is, could you help explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we want to look, especially in this still currently relatively high interest rate environment, that we only purchase properties that have what I call cash flow from day one. Now, what does that mean? If you buy a property and you say, okay, I get a loan or mortgage for that, so you obviously have to pay for the mortgage, then the house needs to be insured. If it's not anywhere close, like in my case, all the houses are at least 1,000 miles away from where I live. So you need professional property management, and you need to put a little bit of money aside for vacancy, for maintenance, and for any kind of capital expenditures down the line. So when you take all of those expenses together, positive cash flow means, is there any money left at the end of the month? Now, a goal that I'm always been going after, and it's gotten much, much harder with the higher interest rates, is that you can say, yeah, I still make $200, maybe $250 at the end of the month. Now, if you have a property that costs you $300,000 to purchase and you can maximum make $2,000 in rent, which would be less than 1%, then that rent will not be enough to cover everything and leave any money on the table. So the 1% rule basically says take 1% of the purchase price and see if your monthly rent matches that number. So a $200,000 house, $2,000 rent would be exactly 1%. Now, I'm not saying if it's 1950, don't buy it, right? But if it's 300,000 and 2,000, so you're $1,000 short per month, then you would probably want to stay away from it. And everybody has to make up their mind. And one thing, if you don't mind me saying, Jeremy, I really appreciate that you pointed this out. The main part beside the mindset stuff that I mentioned about the mentoring is really to say, let me help you become familiar with the process you should go through before actually considering a property. Then during the process of considering, when you actually check the contract, you might pay some earnest money, then you get the appraisal and the inspection, then you negotiate the final price, and then you get to the closing table. And then also, hopefully before closing, you already negotiate the property management contract. All these things have a lot of potential for stuff going wrong. Mm-hmm. And if you haven't done it a bunch of times, I always say in my mentoring program, if we can help somebody to buy 2 properties in that first year, or at least buy one and get the second one pretty much ready, by that time, they have seen most of it, and I have no example that anybody officially left the community. They may have finished the program, but they're still in the community. So by the third one, if you buy basically single family or duplex, having seen it and gone through it 3 times, my tribe members contact me when something kind of weird happens. Like the bank has a weird clause in the loan agreement, or the property managers have something weird in there, right? So all the normal stuff, after having done it practically together 2 or 3 times, is then familiar, right? And if you do it all by yourself, you don't even know what to look for. You don't know if something is normal or not, right? And one thing I'm sure, Jeremy, you would agree, almost all of this paperwork related to anything in real estate investing is not written in what I would say Axel's level of understanding for typical writing or reading. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not like a novel that you can easily write and say that was a cool story.
Right. Because I would suspect that, you've learned a lot of lessons along the way. And sometimes we don't even know what those curveballs are going to be, with respect to executing, on a transaction or managing a property. And so there's a system, right? There's got to be a system, there's got to be a playbook, but there's got to be some flexibility built within the system in order to be able to tackle, some of those headwinds or those black swan events that are not yet known, right? So I know that you've got a system called Ideal Wealth Grower, and it helps empower investors to secure financial freedom like you have. Can you speak a little bit more about that system and how it helps novice investors get started in real estate investing or scaling up their portfolio?
Absolutely, yeah, and you're totally right to your previous point. You don't know what you don't know. So if you have somebody who has already seen it, it's just a much more comfortable endeavor when you do something the first time. So Ideal Wealth Grower is basically 3 words, but it's also 3 words and 2 acronyms. So the word ideal is, obviously, we want to point out that we have a way that we believe to be ideal to grow your wealth, but it's also an acronym that stands for I for income, D for depreciation, E for equity, um, A for appreciation, and L for leverage. And those are all the things that we are getting if we stay in that residential real estate component, right? Those $250 is the income that we're making as positive cash flow. The depreciation is that the government says, look at your house as if it were a machine that you buy for your factory. And everybody knows if you buy a machine for the factory, at some point that machine will reach the end of its life. Now, the government has decided a house as a machine has a lifespan of 27 and a half years. So there are all kinds of other fancy things, but if you don't want to get into them, on your tax return, whatever you pay, let's say $275,000 every year, you write off $10,000 of your taxes as depreciation, right? For 27 and a half years, or as long as if you hold it, if you don't hold it that long. So that's the depreciation. Then equity is for the 20% that you put in. And a little bit of equity also happens if you think about it. The tenants through the rent pay down your mortgage, so the balance gets lower and lower. And in any mortgage, whether it's an investment property or if it's your own house, you always have principal and interest, right? So principal literally means you bought it for 275, and after 1 year, the balance is 274, and then another year later, the balance is 273.5, and so forth. So that 1,000, 1,500, and slowly growing, that's equity in the house that is basically getting in there. Then appreciation is just the market, right? If all the houses of the similar kind go up in price by 3% per year, then your house appreciates basically by that. And then leverage is that we can buy a $200,000 house with $40,000 of our own money and $160,000 of the bank's money. So that's the leverage, right? And that's why I'm also saying, for anybody listening to us and saying, well, there are so many other investments. If you want to have $200,000 in stock, you have to give them $200,000 of your money. If you want to have the asset value of $200,000 in a real estate property, you give them 40,000. That's why I always say it's very hard for the guys in the stock market to consistently compete with us. Besides the fact that they obviously don't get depreciation and all that kind of stuff. But those are the things to realize, and that's what IDEAL stands for. And then wealth is what we aim for. And grower is the way that we actually conduct our mentoring sessions. So again, this is also an acronym that I basically evolved from a book by John Whitmore that's called Performance Coaching. And I accused John, and in a very friendly way, to basically write a book about the first coaching session or mentoring session. And then he stopped. So why? He said, okay, the first thing, the G you want to look for is, what is the goal, or what goals do you have? What do you want to achieve in our context? What do you want to achieve for your money? Then the R is, what is your current reality? Right? What have you done? Where are you? What are you doing with your money? That kind of stuff. Then the O is 2 things. What opportunities have you already looked at or are ahead of you? You might in your family have some chunk of money that you could use or whatever. And what are the obstacles? Grandma says you have to be 50 before you get your paws on it or something like that, right? So that's the O. And then the W is, what will you do? What actions are you willing to take? Right? And if you imagine that were our first session, that would be cool. But what do we do then in the next session? Well, I expanded it to say we need to have the E, because I would say, hey, Jeremy, you committed to these 5 actions. How was that? What was your experience when you actually did these things? Or did you actually do that? So you tell me it sucked and it was way too much. I should have only done 2, whatever you say. So that's the E. And then the R is, what kind of results did you get out of the actions that you took? Right? You might find out, okay, in the area that I was interested in, I can't freaking find any house that meets the 1% rule. Okay, so we now know that's not the area you want to invest in. R also asked the question, this result or these results that you actually gotten out of it, do they make any difference or impact your overall goal? Right? Let's say you have your eyes on an area and you find you can't quite make the 1% rule, but almost, but you thought, okay, I have $100,000 to invest. If I do it right, I could get $350,000 properties. Now you find out the properties are not quite 1% rule. They all cost 200,000. So maximum you can really get out of your 100,000 investment is 2. Well, on your main goal that we started out with, you might have said, okay, I want to get to this point, this time freedom point or freedom point in 8 years. And we sit down and we calculate it out and we find out in those 8 years you would have to buy 12 houses. Well, if the first purchase can only be 2 instead of 3, then you probably need 9 or 10 years. Right? So that would be an example for an impact of your overall goal based on doing a first initial research in your preferred area. Now, you could also say, well, the result is I switch the area so I can still buy 3 and my goal is intact. But that's why it becomes a cycle. As soon as you say, okay, here are the changes to my goal, how do they change my reality? And so we can, every other week when we meet for another session, we can go through this process. And obviously the topic is not always only looking for a property. It's also, have you set up your LLC structure? Have you looked at what kind of protections and insurance you have and what you need? You really need these 12 different subscriptions to all kinds of like paid TV channels and that kind of stuff, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Axel, I really appreciate you explaining for our listening audience the ideal wealth grower system. I bet our listening audience didn't know that this session was going to be a bit of an alphabet soup, so to speak. So certainly appreciate you running through that system with us. And I will be honest, there's a little bit of an elephant in the room right now. The reason for that is primarily because I would say the majority of our listening audience are passive real estate investors. They invest in, multifamily real estate syndications. They're just not as maybe familiar with kind of the turnkey, investing, that you're, recommending. So I would love to hear your input on the differences between turnkey investing and syndication, as being two, popular strategies to create passive income. And how do you help decide which is the best fit for any given investor?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you know what syndication is, a turnkey provider in general, rather than like you may have seen on HGTV, people that flip houses and stuff like that, a turnkey provider is basically 3 companies in one. The first part or the first company is the company that is typically they have been formerly a contractor or construction company or something like that. They go, I always describe it, they go through an area where the company is situated, let's say Columbus, Ohio, and they identify all what I call the ugly ducklings in all the different nice neighborhoods. Because if you drive around, anybody who's ever lived in a nice neighborhood, there's always a few houses that look like nobody cares for them, even if everything else around it is nice. So that's kind of what I mean by the ugly duckling. How is that happening? Typically, like somebody bought that house as an investment property. They got old, maybe they died, and then the kids inherited it. They're not really into this stuff and they don't know much about it. They don't really want to have it. It's sitting there. It doesn't even matter whether it's making money or not. It's just basically deteriorating. So a turnkey provider, contractor part of the business would go and try to buy this for as cheap as they can. And then they renovate it to the modern code. Like most of the ones that I've bought over the year, they put like new plumbing, new electrical, new kitchen, bathrooms. It's basically, other than the frame and the foundation and those kind of things, typically almost like a new house. So that's their first business. The second business is, you would call that real estate marketing and sales. They're basically almost like a real estate agency, with agents and brokers and stuff. Now, the good thing is, since it's their own business, they don't have to charge themselves broker fees or stuff like that. But they have websites and they put, whenever one of their properties is finished with the renovation, they put it out. Now, in my case, most of my relationships, because you mentioned this as so important, and I totally agree, I have these standing relationships with turnkey providers where they send me and some other people that have these relationships kind of like pre-website already the information which houses are about to get ready, and ask me and my community if anybody's interested, because they want to save the time to make all pictures and stuff and get it on the website when they can sell it without that, right? So there, but for all intents and purposes, I call them the marketing and sales company within the turnkey company. And then the third component, or the third company that they have under that umbrella, is property management. And the reason that I, at least initially, always try to get for myself and for my clients properties from turnkey providers, especially when they're far away, is from a psychological perspective. If the same company founded and renovated it and then actually sells it and manages it, you don't have this issue as the owner, where if the tenant says, okay, I just moved into this newly renovated house and the bathtub is not draining properly. Normally, if that happens and you bought it from a flipper, that you literally signed in the contract that you bought it as is and as seen. So the flipper says, okay, I'm out of here. Property management says, okay, where should we go? And then you say, well, somebody must have installed this. Has the flipper done it? Has a plumber done it? And so forth. Nobody wants to take responsibility. And in the end, long story short, you pay for it as the owner.
Yeah.
Different with the turnkey provider, because with the turnkey provider, I insist that anything they touch during renovation, and there is a statement of work that shows everything that they renovated, anything breaking in the first year, it's on them. It's in the contract, literally. And since they are interested in quality renovations, they shouldn't ever be afraid to sign for that. Right. So now obviously other stuff can break, but as long as it is something that has been renovated, and keep in mind, if you do pretty much everything new, only when you use it can you see if all the connections are tight and stuff like that. So it's not that unusual that the tenants initially report a few things, but you don't want to be the one to pay for that. Now, if you don't like the property management, like if we go back to this thing, you are the king or the CEO of your own business. Property management is, in a sense, a department in your company. If you don't like them or you don't like how they operate after a few months, you can say, okay, guys, not to my standards. I find another property manager in the area. You fire the one and hire the other. Now let's answer the question for syndication. In syndication, you basically, and this is the biggest distinction from my perspective, have way less control. You don't really outright own the asset. The company that is typically created for the purpose of a syndication, let's say a 200-unit apartment complex that exists and needs to be brought up to standard and improved and, market rate and stuff, and then ultimately sold 5 years later. Yes, you are basically a shareholder, so to speak, in the company that is being formed, and you're a limited partner, but you don't have anywhere nearly the level of control. And unless you are in a super tiny syndication, you don't have the voting power to really determine what is happening. And if the syndicate decides, for example, to hire a certain property manager, to stay within that same example, and you really hate how they do it, and they always hire the most expensive plumber for every little thing, and every bill for every unit is $300 minimum, you just have to eat it, right? That's just the way, because you don't have the same level of control. And at least to my knowledge, and you might know this better, Jeremy, I'm not aware that you can leverage syndication investments, right? So most syndications I know start at $50,000. So you control, in a limited partner fashion, $50,000 worth of participation in this syndicate. I control, basically, with my $50,000, I control up to $250,000 of asset, and really have control. I can
Right.
say if the thing is painted pink. I can say who manages it. I can say if I want to sell it tomorrow and for which price and so forth. So control is number one and leverage is number two. Those are the two biggest differences I'm aware of.
Yeah, it makes total sense to me, and I really appreciate you breaking that down. The interesting thing with myself is I've got a background in both, right? So I did start, off my real estate investing journey, as a fix and flipper, right, in single family. Got started back as we kind of came out of the global financial crisis. Things were going well. My biggest challenge, as my listening audience knows, is I I ran out of discretionary or disposable time in my day. Having 4 kids and crushing my W-2 paycheck, right, and building up a single family portfolio for me. While the experience was good, all and well, and we did well with the strategy, the biggest challenge that we had is I didn't want to be on the active side anymore. I didn't want to be the one that was having to make some of those easier, tough decisions, right? Because I just didn't have enough time. My kids wanted me to spend time with them on the hockey rinks, on the weekends, and running them from different activity to different activity, as opposed to being so focused on my single family home portfolio, which is why we took that pivot into passive real estate investing through syndication. So I really appreciate you breaking that down for us, Axel. Just kind of wrapping up here, what's maybe next on your bucket list, either personally or professionally, as we round out 2024 and look to move into another new year?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I want to say real quick to your point and why you pivoted to syndication. That's basically, and I really appreciate that you allowed me to do this, why I went to turnkey. Because the things, if you're a flipper, you have to basically find the property and renovate it. And you kind of also have to be the marketing and sales department. If you keep them for yourself, then you have to oftentimes manage it. Now, I basically, as the CEO of my company, and anybody that is a member in our mentoring program becomes the CEO of their company, we outsource everything. Right. And this, I use the analogy, if you were to build a really, really successful, massive cleaning, like a commercial property cleaning company, for a fact that the CEO is not going to go out at night and clean the places. Right. That's why you have people you hire and you have managers who run departments and stuff like that. So this is a little bit, of an important mindset shift to say, I'm taking on the role of the CEO. And as the CEO, when I'm, for example, checking in with my property managers, the conversations, if nothing kind of weird going on, and I have 3 different ones, we talk 20 to 30 minutes a month. Right. But because there isn't much more to talk, and and even if they have an email here and there, or I want to look at the online folio kind of thing, so 24 hours a month is already a stretch. I typically most of the time don't even get to that. Now, to your question about bucket list or things that I would want to do going forward, and it's not just end of this year, but one interesting thing I'm curious about, haven't really made much progress in the research, is a new area that I find super interesting is BTR for 55 plus. So BTR stands for build to rent. So you build a new property or a new house, purpose built for people over 55. And I think they are the better tenants. I think they appreciate at some point in life to have a nice, fresh new house where they're the first tenant and they have the habits of paying. The BTR 55 I find super interesting, and I would like to find a developer who does that. Ideally, a turnkey developer, that would be perfect, right? To start investing into this. Because one thing you have to think about with your generational wealth portfolio is, if you buy 20-year-old, 30-year-old, 40-year-old properties that are renovated and you hold them, like in my case, let's say I give myself another 25, 30 years to be around. By the time my daughter inherits the portfolio, these properties are maybe approaching like 70, 80, 90 years old. Now, obviously, some of or most of the utility related systems are relatively new, but even those would then be 30 years old unless you have a major renovation. If I can transfer some, or maybe in the future, all of my portfolio to properties that were built 2024, 5, 6, and hold those the next 50 years, that's a typical life expectancy of a house. And it would be all newest codes, newest standards and stuff like that. Maybe also a little bit like, energy saving, solar and heat pumps and any of those kind of things, right? So that's something I find conceptually intriguing, but I haven't found any yet. So we'll see if I can find some and try one.
Yeah, Axel, I've really appreciated having you on the show today. Thank you so much for the tremendous value that you've brought to our listening audience. What would be maybe 1 or 2 different ways that our audience can connect with you to learn more about what you're up to?
Well, if they want to connect directly or maybe have a conversation to learn a little more what we're doing, the best thing is to go to idealwealthgrower.com, and there on the top right-hand corner of the homepage, there's a button that says Discovery Call, totally complimentary, and you can kind of check in there. If you want to go to that same site and do /free, you can download our mindset manual, by the way, a little gift to your audience. And if somebody wants to hear a little bit more without having necessarily a conversation, then go to Ideal Investor Show, also a website, and then you can pick whatever episodes we have. And hopefully, Jeremy, you and I will have an episode soon, so they can pick one with you as well.
Yeah, sounds good. Well, we'll definitely put those links in the show notes for this episode. Axel, really appreciated you joining the show today.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeremy. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to describe all these things and the kind of the stuff we do.
Of course. And listening audience, thank you again for joining another episode of The Freedom Point. We look forward to having you join us on the next episode.
Thank you for hanging out with us today and for listening to the Freedom Point podcast, powered by Starting Point Capital. This show is for entertainment purposes only. Nothing said on this show should be considered financial advice. Before making any financial decision, please consult with a professional. This show is copyrighted by the Freedom Point podcast. Written permissions must be granted before syndication or rebroadcasting. If you're interested in connecting, you can find contact information at startingpointcapital.com.